Hi, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, and depending on where you are. And thank you very much for tuning in Nikkei Asia webinar. So more than 2 weeks have passed since the tragic death of former Prime Minister Abe. And he left huge political and diplomatic legacy on Japan. And that impacted the landscape of this region as well. So today, we'd like to assess his legacies and then examine to how much extent his legacy will keep influencing the Japanese future policies and also landscape in this region. And his legacy, as I understand, mainly have 3 aspects. First, he largely enhanced US-Japan security alliance by expanding Japanese contribution. And second, he created the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific and pushed forward the initiative. Now, free and open Indo-Pacific, so-called FOIP, is the key word among major countries. And thirdly, he played a leading role to establish economic and trade multilateral framework in this region as the CPTPP. So these are the main legacies, but there is also a big question. How much will Prime Minister Kishida and the future political leader of Japan be able to follow Abe's initiative and make a progress? Today, we will also examine this topic. Then, for this discussion, it is very fortunate and honored to have 3 best experts to discuss on this topic. Let me introduce. First, Dr. Michael Green. Dr. Green is now CEO of the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney and the senior advisor for CSIS think tank in Washington, D.C. He has been one of the most influential Japan and Asian experts in the US, and Dr. Green came to know Shinzo Abe more than 20 years ago when he was the White House staff. And also, Abe was a deputy chief cabinet secretary. And Dr. Green published a book about Abe earlier this year titled Line of Advantage, Japan's Grand Strategy in the Era of Abe Shinzo. Thank you very much, Dr. Green, for joining us. And then Ambassador Kaushikan. Ambassador Kaushikan is the chairman of Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. And Ambassador Kaushikan is a prominent foreign affairs expert in Asia with nearly 4 decades of career in foreign service in Singapore. That includes ambassador to the United Nations and to the Russian Federation. He also served second permanent secretary and then permanent secretary to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs more than 10 years. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kaushikan, for joining us. And Professor Kotani. Professor Kotani is a senior fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs, who also teaches at Meika University in Japan. And unfortunately, Ambassador Kenichiro Sasae, President JIA, couldn't make it today, but we are very fortunate and lucky that Kotani Sensei joined us. And he has spent years in universities and think tanks, both in Japan and the United States, and teaching as well as doing a lot of research on national security issue and also a regional security issue. And he is one of the top experts in Japan on Indo-Pacific region and maritime security. So thank you very much, Professor Kotani. So let's start. First, we'd like to assess Abe-san's legacy and what will it mean for the future of Japan. Dr. Green, could you maybe please start from, we'll start from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiro. It's good to be with you. It's a privilege to be with Bilahari Kashkan and Tetsuo Kotani. And it's important that we analyze Abe-san's legacy and the trajectory he has created for Japan and the world. But I also think we should start by recognizing that the world and many world leaders lost a very dear and close personal friend. Abe-san was very effective as a leader because people really liked him. He was very warm. I worked with him when I was in the White House, as you said, and kept in close touch. And when I got married, he called me to wish me good luck. When my father passed away, he sent me a long personal note. You can see in the reactions of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India, Tony Abbott in Australia, how deeply saddened and shocked people were because of the person he was, not just the legacy he left. But let's focus on the legacy. I argued in the book that you referenced, that I published this year, that Abe-san was the most, I said at the time, sadly, but we can now say was the most consequential Japanese leader since Yoshida Shigeru, at least in terms of foreign policy. His vision for Japan, the trajectory and framework he set, is one for generations like Yoshida before him. And there are 5 reasons quickly why. First, as you said, he transformed the alliance. In 2015, when Abe-san pushed through, after much struggle, legislation that recognized the right of collective self-defense, Shudan Tekijeiken, that changed everything, or at least permanently changed how Japanese prime ministers would handle security crises. From the US perspective, the ban on collective self-defense was an alibi. That prime ministers used again and again and again. Some tried to get around it, like Koizumi-san during the 9/11 period, or Nakasone in the Cold War. But most Japanese prime ministers use that as an alibi to not be proactive and step up in a crisis. Abe-san made it so that every prime minister now has to take that responsibility. There's no more alibi. That is a big change. Second, as you said, he cemented this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, of a maritime alignment of the US, Japan, Australia, and India and the Quad, investing in South and Southeast Asia with quality infrastructure. He did this to counter Chinese revisionism and hegemony, but also to create a strategic equilibrium that would allow a productive relationship with China, which frankly is more sophisticated than where the US debate is right now. The Biden administration doesn't have a vision for where US-China relations ultimately go. What is the equilibrium? Abe-san's strategy was tough on China, but premised on a stable, or at least a more predictable equilibrium with China going forward. And there is no alternative foreign policy vision in Japan. No serious political leader is offering an alternative. Third, he transformed American foreign policy. When he came to power in 2012, the Obama administration was divided. Many in that administration, I can tell you, were very suspicious of Abe Shinzo. They thought he was a right-wing nationalist. They thought he was a neocon. And the American public, in polls taken by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, more Americans said in 2012, we should cooperate with China than with Japan. In 2019, when the Chicago Council on Global Affairs did that survey, just before Abe-san left office, more than 2/3 of Americans said Japan is our major partner, not China. And among Chichikijin elites, in surveys we did at CSIS, 83% said Japan is our partner, not China. So Xi Jinping helped change that opinion, but a lot of it was Abe-san. And the Trump administration embraced the free and open Indo-Pacific and the Quad. And the Biden administration embraced them and elevated their importance by bringing the Quad from a foreign ministers meeting to a summit. So the third thing is really he transformed American strategic thinking, or to be more accurate, he returned American strategic thinking to where it should have been, the traditions of Ronald Reagan and Alfred Thayer Mahan. Fourth, he held together the liberal institutions that America helped to build, but walked away from during the Trump years. And that includes TPP, but also the G7, which was badly fractured in the Trump years, and Abe-san held it together. And fifth, we don't talk about it much anymore, but Abe-san's 2015 statement on history on the 70th anniversary of the war was, many critics would say, incomplete. And yet it was the longest statement by any Japanese prime minister on the war, longer than any issued by a German chancellor. Abe-san said it would be the last official apology. And amazingly, all of Asia accepted that, except for China and North Korea. And Korea was in a more ambiguous situation. But in Southeast Asia, and South Asia, and in North America, Europe, Australia, it was accepted. He changed that debate in a significant way. Homework, Abenomics was a B+. The Japanese economy grew, but not like it could have. Russia, he failed. I knew he would fail, but there was no Russia card to play. Japan-Korea relations are a big homework assignment to be completed. And he did not finish, and Kishida-san will have to finish fixing the US, because the US is, to my great regret, not likely to rejoin TPP, even though Abe-san held a place for us. What we're putting forward is the Indo-Pacific economic framework. Not very appetizing in some ways, but that's what we have. So a lot of work still shaping American strategy, especially on the trade side, for Abe-san's successors. So a huge consequential figure in the history of the world. Thank you, Aki.
Thank you very much for very comprehensive illustration of Abe-san's legacies. And also thank you for touching upon homework that we can maybe discuss deeper later. So Ambassador Kaushikan, what is a view from Asia or your individual perspective about the legacy and homework and also its impact on the future of Japan? Thank you.
Thank you, Hiro. It's very difficult to follow Mike Green because he has said everything that I wanted to say and everything that is necessary to say. Let me just say I agree with everything he said, and let me emphasize a few points. I think even as we grieve over Mr. Abe's tragic and untimely death, we must recognize the crucial trajectory in which he set Japanese foreign policy for all of Asia. Japan has always played a very central role in Southeast Asia, second only to the US, and that role can only become more important going forward, with or without Mr. Abe among us. Japan has very consistently polled as the most trusted power in Southeast Asia. And it has always played an important role, and Mr. Abe fundamentally reshaped that role to make it more proactive, to meet new challenges. As Mike has pointed out, there is really no alternative to the approach Mr. Abe set in place, primarily because it was very largely a response to structural changes in the environment. Primary among them is a more assertive, if not downright aggressive, China. And that is not going to change, and therefore the course Mr. Abe set is not going to change. I think it's also important, again, Mike has forestalled me, to recognize that Mr. Abe's approach is far more sophisticated and nuanced than many people think it is, or it is sometimes presented to be. It is not just one of being tough on China, but recognizing that China is an irreplaceable part of the region and we have to live with it. And actually, Mr. Abe put into place a framework for living with China while resisting, unacceptable Chinese behaviors. Finally, I think, let me say that some of the basic concepts in which we think about security in our region, primary among them is the Indo-Pacific, the idea of the Indo-Pacific itself. It's an idea that has been accepted by the US, by Australia, by India, by several EU countries, the UK, and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has its own version of the Indo-Pacific concept. Not all of us mean exactly the same thing, but it is a new framework that is going to stay. And of course, Mr. Abe put in a safety net in the form of the CPTPP and the leadership role he played in bringing the RCEP, which to a successful conclusion. Let me stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Your comment reminds me that he embraced China's Belt and Road Initiative at some point. I think it was 2014, yes. And before he visited Beijing. Of course, not fully embraced, but he said that policies to collaborate with China in specific third country infrastructure projects under some conditions. So he basically tried to counter China to coexist with China in a stable manner. Anyway, thank you very much. Then Professor Kotani, you've been based in Tokyo mainly and have been closely watching Prime Minister Abe's diplomacy and security policies. So what is your assessment, and also what is your view about the homework he left for us? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Akita-san, and thanks very much for this opportunity to discuss the legacy of Prime Minister Abe. First of all, I think the number one legacy of Prime Minister Abe is he provided the strategic vision to the Japan security policy. He set the first national security strategy in 2013, and he established the National Security Council to guide the Japan's security policy. And also he expanded Japan's strategic horizon. So he worked, of course, with the United States and regional partners, including the Quad members. But also he strengthened the security cooperation with European partners, which now has a very important implication to deal with the situation in Ukraine, or even the tension across the Taiwan Strait. And he, in terms of internal balancing, he made a very important achievement, which was stopping the downward trend of defense spending. He failed to increase dramatically the defense spending, but at least he stopped this downward trend. That was important. And also he accelerated the jointness among the three services of the self-defense forces, which is critical to defend the southwestern island chain. For external balancing, as Mike pointed out, the 2015 peace and security legislation was very important because this legislation opened up the opportunity to work with not only with the United States military, but also other like-minded nations. And based on that, we now have a reciprocal access agreement with Australia, and we are now discussing the same agreement with some other countries. So for both internal balancing and external balancing, I think he made great achievements. And homework, well, I think as Mike pointed out, the 2015 statement on history changed the perception of international society about Japan and Mr. Abe himself. And I think previously many Western media described him as a nationalist, right-wing, and historical revisionist. But after the 2015 statement, I think this kind of negative image is now gone, except China and South Korea. But more importantly, this image remains in Japan. This is a unfortunate reality. And I think Prime Minister Abe was eager to change the constitution, but because of this negative image inside Japan, he couldn't do it. His proposal to change the constitution was very much moderate, just constitutionalize the self-defense forces. But even this change wasn't realized. So I think the Prime Minister Abe's successors now need to work on these constitutional issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it is very good way to frame his legacy, both in internal balancing and also external balancing. And also, Professor Kotani's comment reminds me that former Prime Minister Abe was the first Prime Minister to have visited NATO headquarters as a Prime Minister, Japan's Prime Minister. I think it was 2007, and made a speech. And then since then, he have been making an effort to connect NATO or European powers with Japan, in addition to Japan, US, or Australia, or other Asian like-minded countries. Thank you very much for your perspective. Oh, I forgot to mention at the beginning, but we will have a Q&A session after a series of discussions. So please put your questions in chat box, and then we will, I will pick up those questions later, and then ask panelists to answer. So then we now understand that how important the legacy Mr. Abe left us. But key question is that he does not exist anymore. And then with that, what does the lack of Abe-san's presence in Japan means for us? So specifically, to how much extent will Prime Minister Kishida and other political leaders in Japan be able to inherit or accelerate Abe initiative? That is the main major question that we face now today. So Dr. Green, could you give your perspective on this specific issue?
Well, in Washington, the biggest concern about the post-Abe era was not so much a change in the direction of Japan's strategy and foreign policy. It was whether or not there would be a return to political instability, because Japan in the post-war period has a history of following strong prime ministers, Nakasone or Koizumi, with a series of weak prime ministers. After Koizumi, there were 6 prime ministers in 6 years. And that really makes it difficult to manage the US-Japan alliance, or for Japan to maintain a strong presence in the international society. So that was the number one concern. And Kishida-san, Suga-san struggled, but Kishida-san has done quite well politically and stabilized his political base. And the upper house victory, and it's perhaps Abe-san's death had something to do with his success, but I think Kishida-san is proving to be pretty skillful politically. So he probably has a stable, pretty long-term government, and that's the most important factor, I think, for people in the Biden administration or in Washington. There's some change from Kishida. He clearly cares more about human rights and democracy than Abe-san did. He's created a human rights special advisor. In some ways, he's more hawkish than Abe-san was as prime minister on China and on human rights and on Tibet. On Taiwan. He's more hawkish than Abe-san was in 2019 or 20, actually. But people forget that because when Abe-san was out of office, he was giving speeches saying we should have strategic clarity on Taiwan, or we should have tactical nuclear weapons. So he was saying more hawkish things as an ex-prime minister. That sort of obscured how much Kishida-san, in his own way, was pretty tough on China. I guess there are 2 things now that might slow down the continuation of the Abe strategy, or at least make the next step up difficult. One is, I sense there's a pretty strong consensus that Japan should increase defense spending. And even public opinion polls about going to 2% of GDP that I've seen show the public supports. But the challenge is going to be fiscal. Can Japan pay for it? And the second thing that worries me a little bit is Abe-san's Kante was very strong in pushing quickly for deregulation or for capabilities. And some of the old Kasumi Ngaseki style of decision-making is returning, which might slow things down. I hope you can hear me. I'm in Colorado and maybe the connection is not strong enough, but generally I see continuity.
Yeah, thank you. We are hearing you very, very clearly, even though you're now you're in Colorado?
Yeah.
Oh, so high in the mountain. So anyway, don't worry about sound. And thank you very much. Your comment gave me an impression that the biggest concern is not necessarily the direction of Japanese policy or strategy, but the key question could be whether Japan can catch up with the external change or internal change that Japan have to to adapt those changes. And so question is the pace of the evolution of Japanese policy, as I understand. So Ambassador Kaushkan, what is your view about the prospect of Japan after Abe?
Well, I think there are two aspects to this. What I think most countries in Southeast Asia are concerned about is continuity. And there are two aspects to that: continuity of policy and continuity of leadership. I am not concerned too much about continuity of policy, because that stems from certain geopolitical realities and the response to them, and those are not going to change. As I said, primary among them is a more assertive China. And of course, Japan's importance to Southeast Asia is another geopolitical reality that's not going to change. Continuity of leadership is a slight worry, but so far so good, shall we say. Our concern is that we should not return to this period of revolving prime ministerships. Of course, different leaders are going to have put their own mark on policy, but within a framework that I think is not going to change too much. I think the key factor that we are concerned about is the Japanese economy. And there are two aspects too. There is the prospect of structural reform, and there is demographics. Others will be more qualified to talk about structural reform, and that's where Mr. Abe was rather conservative, I think, in his approach to that. And I expect that most Japanese prime ministers will be, because Japan is Japan. You are what you are, and you will change at your own pace. Demographics, however, is perhaps the more urgent problem. It is a fixable problem, and Mr. Abe made a start, which has been continued by his successors. You need a more sensible foreign labor policy in the immediate future. And in the longer term, you need to rethink your attitude towards immigration. I don't think these things are impossible. They are going to be very difficult, particularly the latter. But Japan has a history of adapting when it must. And that's maybe a simple way of describing modern Japanese history since the 19th century. You have made painful changes when you must, because you are a pragmatic people. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, Japan, when we look at the history of Japanese strategies, it seemingly doesn't have a consistency, but it has. In the Edo period, Japan closed the border, and at the Meiji illustration, Japan opened the door to the world and westernized, and then Japan allied with the UK to fight against Russia in early 20th century, and then fight against UK and US, and then Japan get defeated, and then Japan suddenly became a closest ally of US up to now. So Japan tried every spectrum of the strategies, but the one consistency is as Ambassador Kaushkan mentioned, adaptation to the change of the security and geopolitical change outside Japan. So I hope that this DNA will keep functioning in a good manner. even after Prime Minister Abe. So Kotani Sensei, what is your view about you touched upon the history issue and also constitutional revision as a homework that we are facing now. And what is your view about Japanese future?
Yes, I think, when Prime Minister Kishida took office last year, I was expecting he will basically follow the Prime Minister Abe's foreign policy vision, except Russian policy. And because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is more, it is easier for Prime Minister Kishida to change the Russian policy now. So I don't see any big change in the Japan's foreign policy direction. And I think in some sense, because Prime Minister Kishida is from a faction known as a pacifist, so his image is more moderate among the Japanese people. So in that sense, I think he has better chances to change the constitution. And I think he will also try to pursue the introduction of offensive strike capabilities. And I think he will try to increase the defense spending. Prime Minister Kishida has never mentioned how much he will try to increase the defense spending. He just said substantially increase the defense spending, while Prime Minister Kishida and his supporters were calling for the doubling the defense spending. And now that Mr. Abe is gone, I think there will be more pressure on Prime Minister Kishida to for the defense spending. And I think one big challenge we might face is for the coming 3 years, we expect no national election. So in that sense, I think Prime Minister Kishida may be able to stay for another 3 years. But we're going to have the midterm election in the US, and also the presidential election in 2024. And if President Trump comes back, I wonder who would embrace him. In 2016, Prime Minister Abe was the first national leader to embrace Trump, and he was criticized for it. But I think that was a critical decision to save the alliance. But if President Trump or Trump-like person becomes the president of the United States, then we have to expect another alliance crisis. So now Prime Minister Abe is gone. I wonder who can do the same. That might be a biggest challenge Japan might face.
Thank you. Yeah, recently I attended the conference in Brussels. It was mainly about the transatlantic topic, but the key issue, as Kotani Sensei mentioned, one of the key questions was what will happen after 2024 presidential election. And NATO countries have a very, very bitter experience about having dealt with Mr. Trump. And they still have a deep concern about the comeback about the future of US, Europe, or NATO cooperation after 2024. But since Japan didn't suffer so much, thanks to Prime Minister Abe, so Japan didn't have so much trauma coming from based on during Trump era. So before we go to a Q&A session, I'd like to go one more round of discussion, starting with Dr. Green. And what do you think will happen after 2024 presidential election? And how does the variable of US variable coming from US will affect the landscape in this region or beyond the US-Japan bilateral relationship? Thank you.
Well, the first thing I'd say is you cannot rule out the possibility that Donald Trump gets reelected. He has deep support in parts of the country, including parts of Colorado where I am. And his supporters say if he comes back, he's going to be more prepared to take over the Pentagon or the State Department than he was last time, to push his isolationist agenda. On the other hand, he's been badly damaged by the January 6th hearings. And, you know, conservative media like Wall Street Journal and Fox News are starting to attack him for the first time, really, and say he's not fit to be president. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I think the past 2 weeks in American political history have been very significant because of the damage done to Donald Trump. The other thing is, you know, when he got elected last time, Europe was traumatized more, but the US foreign policy didn't change as much as people expected. And the reason is that if you look at public opinion polls, for example, the American people are more pro-alliance than ever before. The American people support strategic competition with China. Actually, the American people support free trade agreements, but the problem is Washington is stuck. So the public is not with Donald Trump. Even Republicans are not with Donald Trump's foreign policy vision. And particularly Republicans in Congress, there is a MAGA Trump wing that parrots and imitates what he says about foreign policy, but none of them are on the foreign affairs or defense committees. And if you look at the members of the foreign affairs and defense committees in the House and especially the Senate, overwhelmingly the Republicans and Democrats on foreign affairs and defense agree on what we need to do. So there are a lot of structural reasons in American attitudes, in the American strategic DNA, that would, I think, provide continuity. But it would be a major crisis for the world and for American politics, to be sure, if Donald Trump got elected again. But he is one man, and his foreign policy vision is based on a sort of distorted vision of the 1980s. And when a vision is not based on reality, sometimes it's hard to turn it into a strategy. So I think we would survive. I think it probably won't happen, but I'm not surprised the Europeans are worried about it because, you know, Trump's former defense secretary, Mark Esper, has said the president wanted to pull out of NATO and Korea. And I don't know why the Koreans are not more nervous, but I understand why NATO countries are.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, exactly. When we look at the Trump and Biden administration's policy to China or Asia, there seems to be more continuity than the change. So in that sense, we hope that this continuity will continue in the even after 2024, 2025. So Ambassador Kaushkan, how do you, more broadly, how do you observe the current status of US-China strategic competition? Some people say it is a new Cold War, but I know that you do not agree with that kind of a definition. But what do you think the prospect of this great power rivalry and the impact on Asia? In the context also, there is a ongoing war in Ukraine, invasion by Russia to Ukraine, that will also impact in this region. So could you give me your perspective?
Yeah, well, Akita-san, you know my views about how to describe US-China strategic competition. I won't inflict them on the rest of the audience. I think Mike also knows my views. But it is a new structural reality. And I think there is a better appreciation in Southeast Asia and actually across Asia that in order to deal with the new structural reality that is US-China, that is China, we need the US. We need a better relationship with the US. And I think that is Mr. Abe's essential insight. You will recall that he went to see Donald Trump against the advice of his own officials. But he was right. Because, you know, we may have our preferences about who sits in the White House, but we have to deal with whoever sits in the White House, whether we like it or not, because there is simply no alternative. And I think, Mr. Trump was disruptive. There is no doubt. But he was disruptive of his own officials' institutional approach. If you look at the document that was rather hastily declassified and released at the end of the Trump administration, I forget the exact title, about Indo-Pacific strategy, and you look at the document the Biden administration released in February this year, there is a huge amount of overlap. And the lesson I take from that is that Mr. Trump disrupted his own officials' preferred approach. The reason there is a huge amount of overlap between administrations is because it is an approach basically based on American national interest. And there is that continuity. There is a lot of flux in America because America is the country it is. There's a lot of noise coming out of Washington, and that's always the case. But as Mike Green has himself pointed out in his other book, Not by Providence, there is a basic continuity in American policy towards the Pacific over a very long run. And I take heart from that. But in any case, whoever sits in the White House is going to be a major factor. But I think the forces for continuity are there, and we should not get too excited or too distracted or too disheartened, despite whoever sits in the White House. We have to work with America, whether we like the guy in the White House or we don't like the guy in the White House. That's the reality.
Thank you very much. Your mature observation always make me feel relieved when we look at the very, very fluid world order. Anyway, thank you very much. And Professor Kotani, how do you mentioned about the potential fluctuation of US-Japan alliance after 2024 in case Mr. Trump or pro-Trump president get elected. Could you give me your assessment of a potential damage or fluctuation to US-Japan alliance or to this region? And how should we, or how will Japan be able to adapt or prepare for the potential shock coming from outside?
Well, first of all, I think Japan is now facing a very tough situation. We have the rise of China and nuclear and missile programs by the DPRK, and also now Russia is becoming more aggressive in this region. So US-Japan alliance is now very, very important, and we have to strengthen the alliance. And this is part of the reasons why the Japanese government is going to revise our national security strategy and the defense strategy. And whoever takes over the White House in 2024, I think there's no choice but to strengthen the alliance. If a Trumpian person becomes a president, he or she would criticize the alliance as unequal. So I think we might have to face another challenge of financial contribution to the alliance. But more importantly, we have to fix the worsening military balance in this region, not only the conventional level, but also strategic level. And Prime Minister Abe advocated the kind of a NATO-like nuclear sharing under the US-Japan alliance. And this view was harshly criticized, not only by the oppositions, but also the LDP members. And I don't think the NATO-like nuclear sharing is possible under the alliance, meaning the deployment of US tactical nuclear weapons upon the Japanese soil. But definitely, we now face a problem of the credibility issue. So we have to discuss with Americans how to make the credibility of extended deterrence more credible. So perhaps we have to upgrade our extended deterrence dialogue, including the politicians' participation. And meanwhile, we have to, Japan needs to build up more conventional capabilities. Particularly, we have to fill the missile gap between Japan and other neighboring countries. So the directions are clear. And whoever the US president, the direction is clear. And I think Japan has a lot of homework to do. And even without Prime Minister Abe, I think that Japan will follow his view.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, Kotani Sensei mentioned a very important, very crucial point that is about the credibility of nuclear umbrella provided from US to Japan. If US cannot intervene to Ukraine, to save Ukraine, to avoid the nuclear exchange with Russia, then analogy is that if China threatened to use nuclear and then will make a full-scale invasion to Taiwan, question is that will US be able to intervene militarily or will not? So maybe I'm tempted to ask this question to Dr. Green lastly, before we go into a Q&A about the credibility of US nuclear deterrence and also prescription for us, especially in the context of a Taiwan Strait.
Well, you framed it in terms of Ukraine, and I'd say it's a couple of things about Ukraine and the lessons for Asia and US commitments in Asia first. Number one, the US pulled together, the Biden administration pulled together an unprecedented international coalition to impose geopolitical costs on Russia. Putin is buying drones from Iran because he can't get microelectronic components for his precision-guided munitions, and he can't get drones from anywhere else. Iran is not the best place to buy high-tech weapons, but that's where he's going. So that tells you how crippling the sanctions are, and the sanctions are international. Asian allies, NATO allies, Singapore have stood up and imposed costs, and that is a very important lesson for Taiwan, for China to see. The second point I'd make is the U.S. is providing very advanced weaponry, particularly rockets and artillery that are changing the battlefield. There's not a lot we're not providing. And I don't think the Biden administration is deterred by fear of nuclear war with Russia. I think the Russians are making a lot of noise about nuclear war, but the reality is the Russians are in a much weaker position. And for example, if Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons near Ukraine, he's going to pollute Russia's own agricultural breadbasket. So Russia's making a lot of noise, but I think the narrative, the administration has not done a good job on the narrative, but the reality is Putin is also very deterred by American nuclear weapons. And finally, I would say that Ukraine shows that if Taiwan can develop the kind of asymmetrical capabilities, surface-to-surface missiles, sea mines, javelin missiles, it will be extremely challenging for China to actually try to take to take Taiwan. And particularly since the US Navy in undersea warfare is way ahead of the PLA Navy. Ships could not survive if the US Navy didn't want them to survive. So I think the Ukraine crisis should actually show us how hard this would be for China to attack Taiwan, and how and how committed the US is to its alliances, to NATO, but also to Japan and our allies and partners in Asia. But there's bad news too, which is China is learning a lesson. And I don't think China is going to invade in 2027 or next year. But there are a lot of things China can do to punish Taiwan: cyber, economic embargoes. So I don't worry about a Chinese attack on Taiwan, particularly after Ukraine. But I think Beijing's learned some lessons and is going to look for other ways to increase pressure on Taiwan. And so the situation is dangerous and worthy of a lot of discussion.
Okay, thank you very much for your illustration of U.S. policy and also your observation on war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion, and its implication to this region. So now I have about 43 questions in chat box. So maybe please let me summarize some of the questions by combining them together, so that we can cover many of questions. So now I look at the screen where we see a question. Maybe what I will do is to read out maybe 2 or 3 questions together, and then ask any of you to respond, whatever you want to answer. So maybe first 3 questions. One first question is specifically for Ambassador Kaushkan, but also directed, also related to Dr. Green and Professor Kotani. So should Kishida really accelerate effort to amend Japanese constitution? Would it not raise concerns in the country previously occupied by Japan during World War II? So it's kind of constitutional revision. And then second one is, how do the panelists think of Kishida administration's policy on demographic change and immigration? Is he doing enough? And lastly, is about what are the panelists' view on the future course of Japan's current monetary policy? I'm not so sure that if we have expand on this, but how aggressively should the Bank of Japan act? So if you would like, please answer. Another one that relates to economy. What is the future of CPTPP without Abe? Will China be able to join the CPTPP? So these are the maybe first round of questions. And anybody who wants to start, maybe this time, maybe Ambassador Kaushkan, are you gonna?
Okay, let me be very brief. I think constitutional revision is a red herring. As Professor Kotani has pointed out, what Mr. Abe wanted to do is something rather formal, actually, to have constitutional recognition of Japanese military capabilities, military forces. The real change came, as Professor Kotani and Mike has pointed out, in 2015 with the new legislation that has greatly expanded the range of things that Japanese military forces, whatever you want to call them, are able to do in conjunction with friendly countries. But if the constitution is revised, I don't think the reaction is going to be very bad. The vast majority of countries that were occupied by Japan during the Second World War, including my own, have long ago decided to look forward rather than backwards in their relationship with Japan, in their assessment of Japan's role in the region, which, as I said earlier, is a very positive one. And that's not going to change with constitutional revision. So it's a red herring. Let me say a word about demographic change and CPTPP. I mentioned it briefly in some of my opening remarks. And I think that is a serious vulnerability for Japan, which it should do a little bit more to redress, right? It's not a question of immediately allowing widespread immigration. That would be even more harmful, I think, because it would lead to an enormous backlash. But you can begin by having a more robust foreign labor policy. which is relatively easier to do. And you have made some start in that direction, but it could be accelerated. Now, as far as CPTPP is concerned, I don't think Mr. Abe's presence or absence is going to make any difference to the issue of China's membership. First of all, I personally am very skeptical that China really wants to join. Right? But be that as it may, the issue is, can China meet the requirements? That's not at all clear. And if it can't meet the requirements, I think there is at least a consensus among CPTPP members that any new member must meet the requirements. And that's where we are, and that's where we will remain. As for monetary policy, I'm singularly unqualified to even mention the term.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there anything to add, Dr. Green or Kotani-sensei?
Well, let me add something to the constitutional question. So the current question is whether or not Japan will change the constitution. I mean, the Article 9, and Prime Minister Kishida and the LDP is going to add another clause to the Article 9 to constitutionalize the existence of self-defense forces. And this is relatively becoming easier to do so. But I think the real challenge now is the addition of the so-called emergency clause to the Constitution, so that the Prime Minister of Japan can become President Zelensky in time of crisis. Currently, the Japanese Prime Minister or the cabinet cannot exercise absolute power in time of crisis. And but looking at the situation in Ukraine, in emergency, the Prime Minister really needs a strong power to defend the country. So I think this issue will become will become on the table anytime soon.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Green. Actually, there are next 4 questions have lot of ingredients for your comment. So maybe I will ask you first. But 4 questions. How will the absence of Abe affect Japan-India relations? This is one. And isn't Abe Indo-Pacific legacy with respect to FOIP contradictory to what AUKUS stands for? And how do the Japanese people feel about AUKUS? And then third, will Kishida government be able to successfully double the defense budget given the state of economy and political opposition? And lastly, what are the 3 things that Kishida can do to build on the leadership of Abe internationally? Maybe these three things Kishida can do is maybe we will leave this question for the last comment of yours. So maybe let's add another one. How will the Japanese government handle national security moving forward? Yeah. So these are the 4 next questions, and maybe you can combine or answer partly. But let's start with Dr. Green.
Okay, I'll try to make something delicious like kaiseki, but maybe with all those ingredients, it's going to be chanko nabe with the soup. Japan, India, Abe was, and his grandfather Kishi were very pro-India for a lot of reasons, and so in that sense, he's very unique. His relationship with Prime Minister Modi was very, very strong, and that personal connection Japan may not have again. But the logic of Japan's strategic alignment with India is bipartisan. The number of India-Japan economic and diplomatic and defense cooperation agreements continued to steadily increase from the LDP through the DPJ, even the Hatoyama administration, the one area where they absolutely continued the previous LDP policies, 100% was India. So structurally, I think Japan-India now is in a new place. Abe-san had a lot to do with that, but his presence will not be as necessary as it was, and that's part of his legacy. I don't see a contradiction between FOIP and AUKUS. Actually, I think AUKUS is very consistent with Abe-san's vision that maritime democracies should align together to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. We're not going to have a collective security arrangement in Asia among the democracies like we have with NATO and Europe. We're going to have a variety of groupings, like the Quad, like AUKUS, like the US, Japan, Korea trilateral coordination and oversight group, which has gone quiet, but is a critical part of this architecture. So I don't think there's a contradiction at all. And in fact, my sense is most Japanese national security thinkers see AUKUS as quite complementary and helpful. And in fact, some of the AUKUS agenda, like advanced capabilities, parallels the US-Japan agenda, and in some cases, the Quad agenda. So these pieces will all fit together. The core of AUKUS, a nuclear-powered submarine, Japan could do that someday. I can imagine a day when Japan comes into AUKUS as a partner on a nuclear-powered submarine. But I'm not sure that will happen because I'm not sure Japan has that capability or that requirement. Japan makes excellent diesel submarines and doesn't need the nuclear power because Japan leaves the back door and there's the threat. Chinese ships and submarines are right there. Australia needs the long legs, the long range of AUKUS. The defense question, I would use that to quickly comment on the Constitution. I agree with everything that Ambassador Kashkan and Tetsuo said about the Constitution. I think the world will accept it. I know America will accept it if there's constitutional change. People aren't worried. The question is, how much political capital should Kishida-san use on the Constitution? Or should he be using it on increasing defense spending, which is also a tough political fight, or changing command and control relationships, or if necessary, creating and passing legislation to give the prime minister more authority in a crisis? That's the question, I think, for the Japanese voters to decide. Is this the best use of political capital? And I'll let my friend Bill Harrison answer the question about the future of security in the region and the long-term predictions. And I won't comment on monetary policy either. When I was in the White House, the Treasury Department threatened to kill our whole families if we ever commented on monetary policy publicly. I'm still afraid to do it.
Thank you for your modest reaction to monetary policy question. But anyway, to be serious, thank you very much for your comment. And is there anything that you want to add, Kotani-san or Ambassador Kashkan? Otherwise, okay. Okay, so let's move on. Yeah, 3 questions regards to Taiwan and Japan-Korea relation. So one is, do you expect that Japanese business interest in China will be prioritized over the security in Taiwan Strait? So in other words, maybe how Japan will prioritize it as regards to its approach to China, business interest or security in Taiwan Strait or other area. So second one is, how will the Japan-Korea relationship evolve after Prime Minister Abe? And then, yeah, maybe, yeah, I think that these are the 2 questions for now. So one is the Japanese approach to China, how to prioritize, and also in the context of, especially in the context on tension in Taiwan Strait, and then Japan-Korea relationship. Who wants to respond first?
Let me say something about Taiwan.
Yeah,
huh?
yes, please.
I think it's wrong to conceive of the Taiwan issue in terms of a dichotomy between business interests and security interests. I think the better way to conceive it, and I think the way people do in fact conceive it, is in terms of stability. Because you cannot advance business interests nor your security interests without stability. And that is, I think, the approach that every country should take towards the Taiwan issue. How best to preserve stability in that relationship. As to Japan and Korea, I think it is a little bit overdue that Japan and Korea should improve their security and other kinds of cooperation to meet the new challenges that both Japan and Korea and the rest of us are facing.
Thank you. Dr. Green and Kotani-san, are there anything you would like to add?
Well, I mean, the question is, does Beijing want to sacrifice its economic interests to prioritize Taiwan? And if they do, then I think that Japanese businesses will have no choice but to sacrifice their business interests. The question really, the answer to the question lies in what Beijing chooses to do. I think Taiwan's position in the first island chain is close to existential for Japan's security. And I think Japanese business leaders, and I know many of them, are patriots. It's very different talking to Japanese business leaders than American business leaders. It depends on the American company, but in Japan, most business leaders understand the national interest. And if China puts Chinese economic interests at stake to use force against Taiwan, I think Japanese business leaders will know what that means for their own situation. On Korea, the new Yoon government is such an enormous opportunity for all of us. I mean, I recently learned from colleagues, friends of mine in NATO, that the Yoon government was lobbying NATO countries to pressure the US to do a peace agreement with North Korea. That's how crazy this Korean diplomacy became under the previous government. And the Yoon government is temperamentally and strategically, very much aligned with the US, Australia, I'd say Singapore, at least Ambassador Kaushkan. They're strategic and they can play a big role. Korea can play a big role in the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, re-strengthening US, Japan, Korea trilateral coordination on North Korea. But President Yoon has the weakest public opinion surveys of any Korean president at this point in his presidency. So he's not in the strongest domestic political situation. And I think it's time for some creative diplomacy in Tokyo to think about how to emphasize positive relations. I'm not talking about solving the forced labor issues in the courts in Korea. That's going to be a real ticking time bomb in the Japan-Korea relationship and very hard to solve. I'm talking more about creating and sustaining momentum on strategic cooperation and positive political and diplomatic cooperation. And I think it's absolutely in Japan's interest. But, when I'm sure Bilahari-san has the same experience. When I'm in Australia or I'm in Singapore or Taiwan, people are worried about Japan-Korea relations. It's an imperfection in regional stability that will tempt bad actors. So I think the whole region would like to see improvement, not just the US.
Yes,
Exactly.
yeah. And Kotani-san, do you want to make some comment or?
Yes, on Japan-Korea relationship, I think the many Japanese political leaders are appreciating President Yoon's approach to Japan. But the problem is the presidential election in May was such a close race, and opposition parties is still strong in Korean parliament. So Japanese politicians cannot be assured whether the current direction the Yoon government is showing can be sustainable. So unless the Korean internal politics shows that the President Yoon actually make his words a reality, it's still difficult for Japan to embrace the Korea at this moment. And particularly LDP faction led by Prime Minister Abe was very much kind of negative on the rapid improvement of Japan-Korea relationship. So that might become another legacy of Mr. Abe.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
please.
Sorry, Hiro. I have to jump in at this point. I'm moving to Australia, so if you don't like this, blame the Australians. But look, if Abe-san decided that the US-Japan alliance was indispensable for dealing with China, so he took the huge political risk of embracing Donald Trump. Abe-san decided that the Russia card was a possible opportunity to counter China. So he took the huge political risk of, frankly, embracing Putin. It seems to me that the Korea Peninsula and Japan-Korea relations are maybe not as important as the US alliance, but much more important than Russia to Japan's geopolitical position. So what I've heard from Tetsuo, I've heard from 90% of Japanese politicians I've talked to, and he is accurately reporting the mood. But it's worth comparing that situation with Trump or Putin or other situations where Abe-san and the Japanese government took risks and because it was in their geopolitical interests. Because even if Yoon does poorly politically, we're not. This is a window of opportunity, and I'm not sure we're going to get a better government if we wait. So, as I said, if Japanese friends don't like that, blame Australia. I'm moving to Sydney soon, and it'll be their fault.
Yeah, I believe that the states cooperate each other not only because they like each other, but strategically when they need, they align. Like Roosevelt and Stalin. Roosevelt and Stalin didn't love each other, but they, aligned to fight against Japan, Germany, and Italy. So changing perception, China perception, both in Japan and South Korea, especially South Korea, maybe it will be a kind of like a chance for Seoul and Tokyo to discuss about the China policy and cooperate. That is my hope. So lastly, maybe we have 5 minutes. Maybe we can, if possible, if I may, maybe we can extend a few minutes to finish last round of Q&A, and then I will read. I will read all major questions, and then please pick up whatever you want to answer and make a last comment. Or your comment doesn't necessarily have to relate to a question, but if there are anything you want to say, please make comment. So question is, do you think that Europe should continue to be a priority for Kishida, or are there more important concerns? And another one is, can Japan still compete economically, internationally? And what do Japanese people think of Abe and his legacy? A very, very simple but a difficult question to answer in short time. And what are the shortcomings of Shinzo Abe's foreign policy, and what was the turning point in Abe's life that prompted such a bravery to make changes he made in Japanese economy? Yeah. So I think, there is a very specific question. Will Abe's laser Aegis system and the Lightning aircraft carrier plan be realized? Very specific question. So these are the major question, but you can touch upon, or you don't necessarily have to, but please make a last comment you want to make about the future of Japan, or future landscape of this region. So let's start from, shall we start from who? Maybe Ambassador Kaushkan?
Okay, I am not qualified at all to talk about what is the mood in Japan, Prime Minister Abe's legacy and so on. Just let me make a general comment. I think over the long run, it is almost inevitable that extended deterrence will be loosened because of China's modernization, because of nuclear forces, because of North Korea. In fact, that is almost inevitable. It happened in Europe decades ago, and I see no reason why it should not have, why East Asia will be different. All right. So if extended deterrence is going to be loosened, I think it is important that Japan in particular begin preparing for that day now rather than later. And that preparation encompasses many dimensions, several dimensions. One, of course, is to acquire the right kind of capabilities I'm not suggesting that Japan should make a jump and acquire an independent nuclear deterrent immediately, but there are other capabilities that you need to ensure that countries that are not well disposed to Japan do not miscalculate as extended deterrence loosens, as it must. But it also includes, apart from acquiring the right kind of capabilities, it also includes some things that we have talked about before. For example, a better relationship with Korea, right? Because Korea will face the same dilemma as extended deterrence loosens. And it only makes sense to me that Japan and Korea should work more closely together. And finally, it also includes something that Professor Kotani mentioned, a better crisis decision-making system in Japan. Because there will be crises, maybe big ones, not as big as Ukraine, but there will be crises of some scale going forward, and you need a better way of dealing with them internally in Japan. That's my final word. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Me.
Thank you. And maybe Dr. Green for last words.
Let me pick up two of the questions to make final comments on Europe. You know, the Lowy Institute in Australia in 2019, in its Asia Power Index, which is a really interesting annual report, concluded that Japan under Abe had become the leader of the liberal order in the Indo-Pacific. But in some ways, Abe-san was the leader of the liberal order internationally in the Trump years. It was Abe more than any European leader who held the G7 together, who got US, EU, Japan trilateral talks going on technology. And so I think Abe-san, while we're talking about his legacy, Abe-san would love this question. I've heard talk recently of creating a NATO Asia Council of America's top treaty allies in Asia and NATO to consult, share intelligence. That's the kind of thing Abe-san would have loved, fit his vision, and that would capitalize on the lessons from Ukraine and stabilize the world, and would give Japan global influence that it gained under Abe into the future, shaping not just the Indo-Pacific order, but the global order. The Europe-Japan connection is critical for the US and for global order. And then on the question, you know, what changed Abe? I think that the biggest change, frankly, was when he resigned suddenly in 2007. He stepped down. His cabinet was shocked. He was disgraced, quite frankly, as a politician. And then he got healthy and he studied and he read. And I joined some of his study groups in those years when he was in the wilderness. And he read strategy, and he did what Richard Nixon did after he was defeated by Kennedy in 1960. He studied geopolitics. He prepared to come back. He didn't give up. And he was the man for the moment in 2012. So that's what changed him more than anything was failure. And, you know, on a personal level for all of us, that's kind of a good lesson. If you have a big failure, you can actually become stronger if you study it and come back. So that's a powerful part of Abe's lesson as well.
Thank you very much for sharing a very detailed anecdote about his political career. So lastly, Kotani Sensei, what is your final comment?
Well, following up Mike's comment, I think the resignation of the first Abe administration was the turning point for Prime Minister Abe. My American mentor, Jim Awa, presented the autobiography of Winston Churchill to Abe after his resignation. And Jim Awa said to Abe-san that don't give up, you can come back. And he returned 5 years after. And the biggest change after this sudden resignation was Mr. Abe and Prime Minister Abe were different. Mr. Abe might be a more right-wing conservative politician, but Prime Minister Abe was a pragmatist, and he did everything for the national interest of Japan. So that was the biggest change, and that's the reason why he could he could become the longest served prime minister. And he left lots of legacies, as we talked today, but also he set agenda for the future of Japan. And I think the Prime Minister Kishida and his successors will try to follow those agenda to make Japan a more rich and more safe country.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the distinction of Mr. Abe and Prime Minister Abe is very, very good. Maybe I can use it in some other occasion. Thank you very much for very, very rich discussions. And also thank you very much for all questions. Now I have 54 questions. I hope that I could cover most of it by combining together. And I believe that today's discussion provide not only ingredients, but a lot of recipe about for our thought to analyze the future of Japan. And I hope that we will be able to continue this kind of discussion. So thank you very much for joining us, and all panelists, thank you for all of the comments, and also thank you for audience to tuning in. Thank you.